Good afternoon all. On behalf of the Tibet Museum of Central Tibetan Administration, so I would like to welcome you all to the Tibet Museum's the monthly talk series event. And I am Sring Norbu. Currently I'm working here in the Tibet Museum, and today I'm indeed glad to have with us the guest speaker Dr. Jabin from Delhi. And I can see a lot of new faces today among the audience. So for that reason, I just would like to talk a little bit about the background of this kind of like talk series that we are hosting and why we are hosting this kind of talk series every bi-monthly and so forth. So the main reason behind is like since the Tibet Museum falls under the Department of Information and International Relations of Central Tibetan Administration. So the more particularly falls under the information section, so where the information sections kind of like the main task is to spread or disseminate the information about Tibet issue related to the Tibetans and non-Tibetans. So with that reason, so we are hosting this kind of talk series every bi-monthly. And I would like to give a brief intro about today's guest speaker. Dr. Jabin is Associate Professor at the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies and Director of the Center of Excellence for Himalayan Studies at Shiv Nadar University, Delhi. And formerly, Dr. Jabin was like Assistant Director at the Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi. And Dr. Jabin holds like PhD in Chinese Studies from the School of International Studies, JNU, Delhi. And he has been also Associate Editor of the journal, The China Report. And some of the research interests of the Dr. Jabin are like Chinese domestic politics and Sino-Indian border areas and China in the Indian Ocean region and Indian and Chinese world views and so forth. So without taking much time, I would like to request Dr. Jabin to kindly commence today's event. Thank you so much.
Thank the Tibet Museum and the Central Tibetan Administration for this invitation. And let me thank all of you for sparing your time post-lunch. For this, it's actually, frankly, a little more people than I expected for a post-lunch session, and I hope that what I say will not put you to sleep altogether. I think the topic is, of course, interesting and important, but I have before me a challenge in trying to say something new about it. I see an old friend here, Tenzin Sundu, who I've seen after now many years. So, I am not a Tibet person. I am actually focused on Chinese domestic politics. So the way I approach this entire issue is from how I see the Chinese looking at this subject, right? I just to give you some sense of what how I come to this issue is, as an Indian student studying China about 20 years ago when I started, there weren't too many opportunities to go to China. So you study Chinese domestic politics in your university, but after a while you need a job, right? And when you need a job, that time nobody was really interested in Chinese domestic politics or what's happening inside China. They are really interested about India, China. So when you do India, China, then you have to look at the border issue. And when you look at the border issue, it's inevitable that you look at the Tibet issue, because really, what is the India-China boundary dispute? It's essentially a question about Tibet's place in India-China relations. So that's how I got into Tibet. So rather episodic. So I'm by no means am I an expert on Tibet. But I read a recent article in the Scroll about an Indian traveler called Swami Pranavanda. he traveled to Tibet between 1928 and 1949, about 25 times. He was a former Congress worker, railway employee, and then he decided to give up the the pleasures of the world and turned into a sadhu and a religious man. But he was also a very scientifically oriented man. So his book is called Kailas Mansarovar, simply Kailas Mansarovar, and he has an excellent description of the geography of the place. And he spent, in fact, a whole year. So he was able to observe the change of seasons, the change of scenery around the Mansarovar, Kailas. And so I want to start this talk and sort of try and establish some justification for why I'm doing this by quoting from his book, which I picked up from an article. So he says, "Who can approach Mansarovar where snow falls without clouds? Such phenomena form sufficient material for the ecstatic outburst of a poet." I'm not a poet, but Swami Pranavananda goes on to say, "Thus, the Kailas Manas region engages the attention of any person of any calling or profession, whether he be a poet or a painter, a physicist or a chemist, a botanist or a zoologist, a geologist or a climatologist, a geographer or a historian, a hunter or a sportsman, a skater or a skier, a physiologist or a psychologist, an ethnologist or a sociologist, a pilgrim or a tourist, a hermit or a householder, a clergyman or tradesman, a treasure hunter or a spirit hunter, a theist or an atheist, a scholar or a politician, young or old, man or woman." End quote. So he mentions scholar there. So I feel like I have some foundation to try and address this question of Tibet today, and especially to an audience, I think, who is far more engaged in an intimate way to Tibet than I am. So Tibet in the new era, CPC. I use the official Chinese translation for the Chinese Communist Party. Usually you refer to it as CCP, but the official translation is Communist Party of China, which is what, at least in India, scholars prefer to use CPC, and in the West they usually use CCP, right? And the new era, of course, refers to Xi Jinping's tenure. Since 2012, it's been called the new era. So China has undergone significant changes in political and economic governance since 2012, since Xi Jinping took over as Communist Party General Secretary. These changes have, of course, extended to minority areas that China governs, including Tibet. And in Xi's new era, the attempt continues to be civilize Tibet and to tie it ever more closely to China through a centrally driven policy agenda and one-size-fits-all conceptions of progress and development. Now, this one-size-fits-all, I think, is very important for us, at least Indians, I think, to understand, or something that Indians get very easily, because a large country, problems of governance and administration mean inevitably that diversity is a casualty. If you have too much diversity, too many differences, different ways in which things are done, administration becomes a problem. It is impossible for somebody sitting in New Delhi or somebody sitting in Beijing to actually create a craft of policy that can be applied across the board. Of course, in India, we call ourselves a federal republic, but I think the Indians will know that there's a very little federalism actually in operation. And as somebody who studied Chinese political economy, I can tell you, in many ways, the Chinese have greater federalism, at least in the economic policy-making domain, than India does. But be that as it may, I think what I try to do in this presentation is just look at two things. One, what are China's plans for Tibet, the Tibetan Autonomous Region, plus the other Tibetan areas, and then very briefly, what do they imply for the rest of the world? And greater control is really the framework in which I sort of make this presentation. It's about 20-30 minutes and I'll be done. So the central theme that I talk about is that the CPC is trying to normalize what is going on in Tibet by talking about development. Economic development in Tibet as something natural is no longer something about doing something special for Tibet, or because Tibet, you know, as the Chinese, according to Communist Party version of events, that Tibet was backward, Tibet suffered from religious, the rule of the religious clergy. But now, under Xi Jinping, Tibet is going to be treated in many ways, at least on the economic development front, just as any other part of China. And in that very normalization of what is happening in Tibet, I think is a very is a strategy of control, of establishing control over Tibet, that creates a narrative that the rest of the world has trouble opposing. Because how can you oppose, say, building better roads? How can you oppose it when the Communist Party says we are settling nomads in order to ensure better access to health and education for them, right? So this sort of a narrative, I think, is something that we have to be conscious of. And I frame my talk in the context of Xi Jinping's first visit as General Secretary to Tibet, or the Tibet Autonomous Region, in 2021. You know, he has visited Tibet before, in 2011, when he was still, before he became General Secretary. But he waited 10 years before he visited Tibet as General Secretary. And I think that says a lot about, you know, how the Chinese see Tibet. And it's interesting also because he had visited Xinjiang, which is another troubled minority province, as early as 2014, right? So obviously, much preparation went into the visit in 2021, because in the previous year, TAR, the Tibetan Autonomous Region, at least saw visits by top leaders Wang Yang, who is the number 4 in the Communist Party Politburo Standing Committee, and the number 4 is usually the guy who deals with Tibet and Xinjiang issues. All right, Ho Chunhua, who was a former, who was then Vice Premier and former party secretary in TAR, Wang Yi, who is a Foreign Minister of China, also visited Tibet. So you can see that there is a link between what China does in Tibet and what it is trying to portray to the outside world. Because otherwise, why else would a foreign minister be visiting a province, and why would that visit be given so much prominence? And in August 2021, right after Xi Jinping's visit, the 7th Tibet Work Forum was conducted. You know, and the following May, the Chinese government issued a white paper to present what it called a true and panoramic picture of the new socialist Tibet. So there is this constant emphasis to say new everywhere, as if there is something new happening. And I think it would be wrong of us to dismiss it when the Chinese say new, because there is something new that we need to be alert to. Yes, many of the oppressive practices continue, practices of surveillance, practices of suppression of religious freedom, etc., all of that continue. But there are new methods being adopted. There are new methods adopted of how to counter negative foreign images or narratives and so on. So while she has regularly made pronouncements on Tibet-related affairs, what should be underlined is that he is not referring to the Dalai Lama or the Tibetan exile movement only, but talking like a leader would talk about everyday issues of administration. The constant references to the new to describe the party state's approaches to the conditions of development on the Tibetan plateau also underline Xi Jinping's attempts to leave a personal imprimatur or a personal impression or influence on Tibet policy. This ambition or desire to stand out from China's previous leaders, I argue, will have consequences for China's domestic politics, but also for China's neighbors and for the wider world. I will look at two issues. One, of course, is development. The other issue I want to talk about is how is China approaching cultural issues in Tibet. Let me start with development. Now, economic development is obviously a big priority for the Chinese leadership. And if those of us or those of you who follow foreign policy or China's Belt and Road projects with other countries, you will see that the Chinese always use economic development as some sort of a panacea, as some sort of a source of creating stability in weak, underdeveloped countries. So this is how they go into Pakistan, they go into Sri Lanka, saying economic development is good for you. You're poor or you have ethnic strife or whatever, but let us come and start let's build a stadium, let's build a road, let's create some economic development, and then people's minds will be taken off because they have economic opportunities. So this is something they actually genuinely believe. You cannot simply dismiss it as Chinese propaganda, and I think it's very important for us to sort of should I do something like this? I think it's a good signal for me to know when I should stop talking. Maybe 4 times and I will stop. So it is very important for us to know that when the Chinese take it so seriously, and if we don't take it seriously, then we might respond to this in the wrong way. I mean, our responses to these policies will fall short because we are not able to understand or following what the Chinese are also intending with some of these projects. And some of it they mean sincerely. Of course, they want political influence through economic influence. But I think the economic idea that economic development will bring stability is something that they very deeply believe in. They might now begin to see that it might not always work. But that is of little comfort to us who have to deal with the after effects of Chinese development projects in South Asia, for example, especially for India, right? During when the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China, this was in 2021. It was celebrated, of course, with much pomp and ceremony, including in minority areas. But even then, while China has advanced a great deal, the distance between minority areas or the difference between minority areas and the rest of China is actually still visible and still stark. So the Communist Party is under some degree of pressure on this front. But like I said, the argument is that the normalization of development activities in Tibet is no longer the case of something being done only for Tibet, but that it is part of a larger logic of governance and administration. The Communist Party is, because of the natures of Marxist, it's a Marxist party, the material conditions are always important. So if you show material improvement in material conditions, then the Communist Party has legitimacy. At the 7th Tibet Work Forum, Xi Jinping specifically called for improvement and better implementation of policies on, and please note, income, housing, medical care and retirement, and education for children of Tibetan cadre. Now, if you look at all of these, if you just look at it very neutrally, these are topics that any political leader, any politician will talk during an election rally or an election speech. And this is something that all people are now taking as given. This is what you have to talk about. Even in India, if you follow politics in India, it's all been converted to a politics of development, right? So this is happening also in China. And if you look at Xi Jinping's itinerary in Ningxi, which is just opposite Arunachal Pradesh in the east, urban development, poverty alleviation are also equally important concerns. And Xi Jinping is talking about building up rural infrastructure, and he uses an expression called rural vitalization, right? It's like in the past, Indira Gandhi had this slogan called Garibi Hatao, remove poverty. So in many ways, I think one of the advantages of me being an Indian scholar studying China is that it is astonishing the kind of similarities that can occur between two countries, even though their political system is different. Simply because the scale of problems or the scale that we are dealing with in India and China, 1 billion plus population, 30 odd states or provinces, large cities of millions of people, the scale of administrative problems sometimes requires some of the same kind of solutions. Not that all of the solutions are good solutions, especially for a democracy. But there is now, unfortunately, an increasing tendency also to believe in the so-called quote-unquote Chinese efficiency. You'll find a lot of Indians saying, oh, we need to be like China. And I think I find that disturbing because being like China means that, well, you have efficiency at the cost of justice, or at the cost of human rights, human development, and so on. But if you are a certain elite, if you have certain, if your life is already good, you want it to be better, and even at the cost of others who might not be, privileging, might have the same privileges as you. And so it is not for. It's you look at Xi Jinping's entourage, the people accompanying Xi Jinping. He was accompanied by another vice premier, a Politburo member called Liu He. This is of course the previous Politburo, but Liu He was the guy in charge of economic policy. Informally in charge of economic policy, though formally Li Keqiang, the premier, number 2 on the Politburo Standing Committee, was, but in practice it was this guy who had the ear of Xi Jinping, and he is the guy who was supposed to be the guy advising Xi Jinping on economic issues. So clearly, to bring such a heavyweight on his trip means that economy is a big issue. Similarly, in China, there is something called the National Development and Reform Commission. This is the equivalent of India's old Planning Commission, or now what is called the Niti Aayog. It's a think tank, but it's much bigger than the Planning Commission and the Niti Aayog put together in a way. So it is this body that is in charge of the large mega projects in China, and also this body that is in charge of the Belt and Road Initiative with foreign countries. So the chairman of this body was also accompanying Xi Jinping. Now also look at the other more modern issues that leaders have to talk about. So Xi Jinping visits the Nyang River in Ningchi, which is a tributary of the Yalung Sangpo, or what in India we call the Brahmaputra. And he specifically talked about ecological preservation. The Chinese have this new concept called ecological civilization. So this is the Chinese response to the challenges of environmental degradation and destruction that China's economic growth of the last 30-40 years has created. So now the Chinese are very serious about environmental issues. It's another matter that the Nyang River is actually also receiving a lot of waste from mining projects up along the river. That is also part of the extractive industries that the Chinese government or Chinese state is promoting in Tibet. But one can argue that this is a sign that the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese state has become cognizant of an environmental problem in Tibet. Remember, in the 80s, 90s, one of the big arguments for the Tibetan movement was the destruction of Tibet's environment. At that time, nobody was talking so much about the environment, but this became a cause that everybody could rally around. How can you destroy the environment? Yes, okay, we can't do anything about human rights or anything else in Tibet, but Tibet's environment is important because Tibet is the roof of the world. Water supply from Tibet goes to other parts of the world, other parts of the region. So Tibet's environment is a universal concern. But now look at how the Chinese have co-opted this argument by ideas such as ecological preservation or ecological civilization. So now in China, environmental issues are one area where a lot of protests are actually allowed by local and central government authorities as a way of as a feedback mechanism, saying, okay, we need to fix this. And since Xi Jinping has given the order that China needs to fix its environment, this has now become an area where leaders are pulled up if they do not meet environment targets and so on. So you see, Tibet is now, this argument about environment, while it is still a serious issue in Tibet, the Chinese are at least creating the impression that they are looking at or talking about environmental issues and so on. Similarly, in India, we have this Swachh Bharat campaign for cleanliness and so on. The Chinese have what they call the toilet revolution. And if you looked at photographs of Xi Jinping's visit, you saw that Xi Jinping was actually inspecting toilets. Now, you could talk about this as, here's a leader who's looking down, getting into the nitty-gritty. But from a cultural perspective, from a cultural politics perspective, he's also signaling where Tibetans stand in the cultural hierarchy. This impression that Tibetans are somehow less civilized than the rest of China. This is also politics that is, and this is a message, of course, that is maybe not easily understood outside China's borders, But within China, it is a signal of hierarchy, right? Okay, Tibet is here and we are up there, right? Similarly, Xi Jinping using the train to travel from, he landed in Ningxi from Beijing directly by plane, but he took the train from Ningxi to Lhasa. Now, this is again signaling both internally but also to India. For those of you who know India's development projects in India's border areas, we don't even have a single road connecting Arunachal Pradesh laterally. If you travel in Arunachal, you know you have to go like a W. Each time you have to get into Assam, go up, come down, go up, come down, go up. It's like a W. So we've been talking about this big road for a very long time. So forget about railways. But here, the Chinese are signaling to border populations in India, look at development on our side and look at development on your side. Where is democracy, or what has democracy gotten you if you're still 30, 40 years behind China? And this is clever politics, or you can call it propaganda, but I think it's also clever politics because, and this is actually a fair point that you will make. Why is it that a democracy has been so inefficient in providing development to its own people, right? Why is a democracy inefficient? There are many reasons for it. For people who make the argument that we should be like China, I have a whole set of arguments saying the problem is not democracy, the problem is lack of accountability in a democracy. We've all had all these plans for decades, but it never takes off the ground because of corruption and so on. But that's a lack of accountability. It is not a problem with democracy per se. But yeah, let me stop the development side here, and let me come to the cultural politics of China's development under Xi Jinping, right? How is greater control exercised through culture or cultural events in Tibet in the new era? Now, on one of his visits to Qinghai, this was before 2021. Xi Jinping has of course visited Qinghai much before. This was another part of old Tibet, and he talked about the promotion of cultural capital, preserving and promoting traditional handicrafts, etc. In Qinghai's Tibetan areas. This has become a sort of a mantra now that Xi Jinping is talking about cultural confidence for the Chinese. The Chinese should be culturally confident and talk about their culture, their history, their civilization much more in World Forum and so on. So that's happening. That's sort of what is happening in the rest of China is also sort of coming across to Tibet and Xinjiang. Of course, it also means a great deal of falsification of history. And but before we get into that, I want to sort of quote Mao in 1949 when he predicts that an upsurge, and I quote, an upsurge in economic construction is bound to be followed by an upsurge of construction in the cultural sphere. The era in which the Chinese people were regarded as uncivilized is now ended. We shall emerge in the world as a nation with an advanced culture. In 1949, before China is developed at all, Mao Zedong is making this prediction that once we become developed, we shall proceed with construction in the cultural sphere. So this is not about only preserving culture. It's also about using culture for political ends. And I think that's what we are beginning to see now in Tibet, as the rest of China is completely developed and China has excess capital to divert to construction, infrastructure development, economic development activities in its minority areas. Now, as that sort of picks up pace, the next stage is creating a certain kind of culture mediated by the party. And that cultural politics is about suppressing what is traditional Tibetan culture, but forcing Tibetan culture to fit into the Chinese mold, be subservient or be considered as part of what is Chinese culture. And so when Mao refers to civilization, he declares it the purpose of the new Chinese nation to foster its own civilization and well-being, and at the same time to promote world peace and freedom. So in other words, there's already an immediate connection drawn between China's past and its future with aims that are also global, not just Chinese or national in nature. And in 2017, October 2017, at the party congress in 2017, the 19th party congress, Xi Jinping actually, in the run-up to this congress, he writes a letter to a Tibetan herding family in Shannan, which is again opposite Arunachal Pradesh, prefecture opposite Arunachal Pradesh. He says, grazing and guarding the border is your duty. He writes to this Tibetan family, and he encourages them to, quote, carry on the patriotic spirit so that more herdsmen will take root in the snow-capped border and be the guardians of our holy territory. So you see the language. When you talk about holy territory, be guardians, he's actually assigning a certain role to Tibetans, but he's also sacralizing this territory. And when it is holy, of course, he's playing on Tibet's religious identity, but he's also making in another speech, and I think this is something interesting that I've noticed of late. Everybody knows archaeology. You think archaeology is a very boring thing, okay, you keep digging stuff, etc. But in China, archaeology is a very political exercise. Okay, so Xi Jinping actually makes a speech and this is published in a party journal called Chiu. I think he makes a speech in 2021, at the end of 2021. The speech is called Building Archaeology with Chinese Characteristics and Chinese Style. Better understand the ancient and profound Chinese civilization. Chinese have a tendency to use big words, long titles. It's a Communist Party of China. I shouldn't be saying simply Chinese, but the Communist Party of China. All right. What does he say in the speech? He says that archaeology has, quote, important social and political significance. I mean, I'm a scholar, I'm an academic. In my university, we have a department of history and archaeology, and I would be shocked if my colleagues started talking about saying archaeology has political importance. I mean, as a scholar, you are only doing archaeology to discover what truth there is. But of course, yes, archaeology does. I mean, if you follow politics in India, of course, this has political significance. But it is never mentioned directly, does it? You only hear somebody else talking about it, but you never hear leaders state it explicitly. But this is Xi Jinping speaking to his crowd in an internal meeting, which is published later for public consumption, saying archaeology has important social and political significance. He says his objective is to, quote, educate and lead the vast numbers of cadres and the masses, especially young people. So he's targeting the young already, to recognize the major contributions of Chinese civilization, unceasingly strengthening the Chinese nation's cohesion and sense of pride. So you also see the concerns that the Communist Party has vis-a-vis Tibet, that lack of Communist Party control or stability in Tibet affects Chinese cohesion or Chinese pride. He says archaeology, quote, illustrates the multi-sourced unity of the Chinese Minzu, the Chinese people, and Chinese civilization, and the unified formation and development course of the country. So ethnic unity is clearly an objective of Chinese archaeology or Chinese political archaeology. So what does this mean? In 1949, I started with Mao in 1949. In 1949, when the Chinese took over, Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1950 when they took over Tibet, control of Tibet was only, according to their Chinese own records, they only claimed Tibet from the Qing dynasty, the 16th, 17th centuries, right? Not 16th, the 18th century onwards. That's it, when they wanted. But in time, it moved back a bit to the Mongol dynasty, the Yuan dynasty. Then it moved back to the Tang dynasty. And now they are engaged in archaeological expeditions in Tibetan regions and trying to prove that Tibet has historically been part of China. And this is the big argument, the big ask of the Dalai Lama, that you have to say that Tibet was part of China since antiquity, right? Because if everybody doesn't accept this claim that Tibet was historically a part of China, then there is really no claim on Tibet. So the sort of conclusion I have here is that together all these phrases, all these expressions on talking about archaeology, talking about political archaeology, talking about civilization and cultural preservation or handicraft, creating industries out of handicraft in Qinghai or in Tibet, in TAR. All of these are part of a larger political and cultural project of exercising control. Physical control is there already in Tibet. There's no question about it. They are not worried about physical control. But they want control over the narrative. They want people to believe that this physical control is justified, is legitimate. And for that, you need to create narrative. You need to rewrite history, create history. So it's a focus on greater assimilation of Tibetan areas into the mainstream of the Communist Party's thinking and national identity. Clearly, this also means that the Communist Party is less than confident about the loyalties of its Tibetan population. And, one of the interesting parts of Xi Jinping's visit to Tibet was it was not announced previously. It was only announced after he'd left that this visit had happened. So, so now let me come to the what does it mean for the world? I think for India, I already talked about how this example of infrastructure development in Tibet can be used as propaganda tools against the Indian border populations. The speed of construction actually shows up India's own lacuna or weaknesses. At the same time, India's border populations have no illusions about what actually goes on in TAR. They are quite aware of the religious suppression, the lack of freedoms, etc. But in a time when politics in India, politics across the world is all about economic development, economic growth, and access, speed, 5G communications, etc. Getting everything in real time. I think there are always going to be pressures and comparisons made, unfavorable comparisons made, which will put politicians, democracies under pressure to achieve the same kind of speed and growth that you see in an authoritarian state like China. And that's something that civil society needs to prepare itself for in order to, because this is a sort of a ground which allows not just greater control in Tibet, but the extension of Chinese influence into democracies. And one of the arguments that I make is that the Communist Party might be all powerful within its borders, but Communist parties survive. The nature of the Communist Party is one in which it has to constantly have an enemy, have an other. And if it is stable at home, then it needs to create an enemy from somebody outside its borders. And that enemy is really the idea of democracy or accountable governance in its neighborhood. So Indian democracy is a threat to the Communist Party of China. Democracy in the United States will be a threat to the Communist Party of China. And today the Communist Party has the resources, the technological resources, the economic resources in order to run misinformation and disinformation campaigns in democracies. We are only concerned about how the Russians are interfering in American elections. But the Chinese are also involved in such activities in Taiwan, for example. Taiwan is going to elections next year. So this is a space to watch. How is China influencing journalists, intellectual elites, political elites, business elites in other countries? They have a whole network to do all of this stuff, right? And by contrast, India, I think we've not had the kind of confidence in our border populations to let them be examples for border populations in Tibet. Right now, the only example is a negative example. India's border populations are underdeveloped. Populations on the Tibetan side have physical infrastructure and access to connectivity and so on. I mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. I think we have to, now that COVID is over and I think the border in Nepal is opening up, you will see that the Communist Party is much more confident of its control in Tibet to actually use the Tibet Autonomous Region as a prong of the Belt and Road Initiative into Nepal. When the Belt and Road was initially launched, Tibet was nowhere on the scene. The Communist Party used multiple other provinces in China to push the Belt and Road in different countries in Southeast Asia. They would use the provinces bordering Southeast Asia. They used Xinjiang to connect with Central Asia, but they never used Tibet to connect with Nepal or India. But that confidence, I think, is now increasing. So this is something to watch. Of course, you have the case of recent case of how some places in Arunachal Pradesh were renamed by the Chinese, right? This is interesting. The Indian government has simply dismissed as, oh, it doesn't change anything on the ground. But what I would point out is that this is what has been called lawfare, warfare mixed with legal means. So the Communist Party is using legal means to show claim over Arunachal Pradesh. Now, for Indians, it doesn't matter. But the Chinese have a vast information network. Chinese have television networks, newspapers, or websites that are translated into multiple languages. So somebody sitting in Kenya watching the China Global Television Network in English, or somebody sitting in Buenos Aires watching the China Global Television Network in Spanish, is actually seeing this renaming of places in Arunachal. And from their point of view, where is Arunachal? Oh, it's part of China. It's no longer part of India, right? So you see how the narrative has changed. Maybe it doesn't matter for 1 billion Indians what the Chinese have done. But for 4 or 5 other billion people around the world, the narrative is this is now part of China. They don't even think of it as being disputed, but they think that this is now part of China. So yeah, so I suppose the final argument I have to make, and I'm glad to see it hasn't gone blue yet, though I did cheat, I did press once, is that we make a mistake if we look at Xi Jinping's activities in Tibet only as being targeted and aimed at Tibet. It is also about sending a message to the outside world. It's also about sending, so before the idea was, look, we have to legitimize our control in Tibet, we have to control Tibet. But now the Chinese state is confident enough with its resources, with its ideological resources also, political narrative, the diplomatic service is a very large diplomatic service that the Chinese have, academic, intellectual services, the money that I can tell you that as an Indian academic, I'm envious of the amount of resources that Chinese academics have. Okay, so the resources that they put into multiple streams, diplomacy, economics, academia, they have the confidence now to say that we will not fight the battle for control or legitimacy in Tibet, only in Tibet, but we shall now fight this battle outside of Tibet's borders, outside of China's borders. And if we are not alert to this this narrative, I don't want to call it propaganda, because propaganda creates a negative impression and you think propaganda is weak, but this is very strong and you have to give it its due respect if you have to deal with it properly. So China is confident enough now in the new era under Xi Jinping. It's no longer biding its time or hiding its capabilities like Deng Xiaoping said. It is actually doing something. It is confident enough to take the battle for control of Tibet, the legitimization of its control over Tibet outside China's borders. And this is something that as those of us living outside of China are concerned about issues in Tibet, must be cognizant of, aware of, and be alert to, and create our own methods for dealing with this. So yeah, let me stop there. Thank you so much for your attention.
Yeah. So I want to ask a question about Arunachal Pradesh. I see that among the Tibetans, we have better understanding of Arunachal Pradesh than the Indians about Arunachal Pradesh. Mm-hmm. Because the whole McMahon Treaty was signed with Tibet, but there's no recognition of that in India. At least India doesn't say that. So my question is, for government of India, the India's control over Arunachal Pradesh, does it start from Major Bob Khadin's control over Tawang region, or does India still go back to the historical, documented a legalized paper from McMahon Treaty?
I think, see, as a democracy, I don't think we have any qualms in admitting that while the 1914 McMahon Line is what gives us control over Arunachal Pradesh, we were, I mean, British, of course, we didn't have control over what the British did. But 1951 is when we first, Bob Khating goes to Tawang and so on. And yes, we were responding to events in Tibet. We were responding to Chinese control over Tibet, and we took our time. And that's just a fact of life. And we have, I don't think this is an issue for us, nor does it delegitimate our claim that because we were slow, or we moved slowly, or we moved next, or we were responding, that in any way or form this makes it less, or somehow our claim over Arunachal is in doubt. I think under Pandit Nehru, he had the view that Asia couldn't, or Asian geopolitics couldn't follow the same way colonial politics continued. Look, in the past, we didn't need visas or passports to go across these borders. Where did Tibet end? Tibet ended in a way, I think this is something I've heard, Tibet ended where the mosquitoes started, right? So in a way, these were fluid. It didn't really matter whether there was a hard line between political entities, as long as people continued to exchange, people lived peacefully and so on. But I think we grew up pretty quickly once the Chinese took control of Tibet. We realized that this was an expansionist state, and therefore we needed to look at it very differently. But even so, you saw that until 62, we hadn't fully woken up to the Chinese threat, right? It took 62 before we learned. And how did we deal with 62? We dealt with 62 by pulling back our border populations and not building infrastructure in a sort of misguided approach to dealing with China. But I think with the benefit of hindsight, we should say that we lacked resources then. We lacked public attention on this. Today it's very different. Today, if you see how we have responded to Galwan, we've managed to speed up a lot of the things that we needed to do with respect to China because Galwan happened. So I think we are confident about our claims of this region. But more than that, I think our claims are based on allowing the Arunachalis to choose what is best for them. We have elections in Arunachal. They allow Arunachalis choose their own government. They have their own systems. We are conscious and conscious of cultural heritage and cultural concerns that Arunachalis have. Issues about environmental damage by big infrastructure. Why do you think that road between why is it infrastructure development not progressing so fast in Arunachal? Because we are trying to take on board concerns of the locals, right? So I think that's one of the costs that we pay as a democracy, but that's also the reason why the Arunachalis understand that you might see progress on the other side, so-called progress on the other side, but that is the progress that comes with a cost. So yeah, I think it's useful to see what's happening on the Chinese side, but we cannot also expect in a democracy the people to simply say, oh, things are bad there, therefore this is better. I think as a democracy we need constantly to be doing something positive rather than simply accepting things by default.
Yeah, just to make myself understood properly, this question is not about Tibet, it's about Arunachal Pradesh, and the question precisely is about how does India recognize Arunachal Pradesh, and so therefore the question is, does the government of India understand Arunachal Pradesh as it was in 1951 when Major Bob Khating took over? Is it only this, or do you still go back to McMahon Treaty that was signed between British India and Tibet?
Well, if you
one more thing.
Sure.
Recently, United States passed a resolution saying that they recognize
McMahon
McMahon
Line,
Treaty.
yeah.
So is this a revival of McMahon Treaty, which India doesn't seem to be talking about, because India is saying, in 1951 we started to take control of this.
See, if you ask me the question directly, then we will say we are successors to whatever the British left us. Right? So there's no question about it, right? But we have a boundary dispute with China. And our treaty agreements with the Chinese, the 2005 agreement on political parameters and guiding principles, essentially says the boundary dispute has to be settled on the basis of the latest advances in cartographic techniques, and also keeping in mind, which is a political parameter, keeping in mind that settled populations will not be disturbed. Now, so if you follow the latest cartographic principles, and also, by the way, there has to be a certain common sense approach about how, because look, that McMahon line, it's an infeasible line. It was drawn with a nib, it covers 20 kilometers area on the ground, so it's just impossible for us to hold on to every single inch of territory as signified by this nib of the pen used by McMahon. So from that point of view, the border will change. That line, the McMahon line will change. But what the principle is that this is broadly the line. I mean, you cannot, as the Chinese do when they claim it's basically the upper banks of the Brahmaputra, right? That's not happening. It is the line broadly where it is, but we will make adjustments depending on the current situation or reality on the ground, as well as geographic principles. And I think you saw this happen also in the Doklam issue. That was a full treaty that was signed between the Chinese, the Qing, and the British. But even there, the Chinese had their own different interpretations, and we had our own interpretation, right? So I think the 2005 agreement makes it very clear. We are not in any confusion about whether this belongs to us and what is the basis of our claim. There is no confusion there. But we do acknowledge, I think the 2005 treaty does imply that when this boundary has to be settled, there will have to be changes in the line drawn, because there will have to be the latest scientific techniques and so on, and consideration of population centers along the border area. All of this has to be considered. Yeah. Okay. Right. So, did you have a question? Yeah, sure, please.
Yesterday, today, and tomorrow are the International Days of Awareness and Action for the widespread collection of DNA in Tibet by the Chinese. And I'd just like to get your perspective on what their potential end game may be with all this collection.
Well, I don't know. Do you read science fiction?
I've read a lot of science
Yeah.
fiction, but this is reality. They're
Yeah.
collecting the DNA.
So,
what are they doing?
Yeah. So, well, this is basically your dystopian world come true. I think this is predicted plenty in science fiction. I think technology now has become a real tool of administration, not just for democracies, but for authoritarian states as well. And authoritarian states are in a better position to use technology because there are no checks on the use of technology. And here, whether it is DNA collection of Tibetans or putting the barcode on knives used by Uyghurs, this is a way of control and surveillance of populations. There are, surveillance is one thing, but remember there are also very strong commercial incentives. Chinese facial recognition has gotten so good. In the West, facial recognition is so bad that one black man is the same as another black man. Facial recognition technology is based on only white faces. It's quite poor. But in China, facial recognition is taken as a strategic tool, and the Chinese are pushing their facial recognition technologies and companies into Africa. They're trying to build a database across the world, perfecting their technologies. So you can distinguish between a Han, an Uyghur, a Tibetan with Chinese technology. So what is the end game? Control. No authoritarian state will give up an opportunity to perfect its control over individuals. I think the comparison with 1984, George Orwell's 1984, I think it's still not perfect. I mean, George Orwell goes much more. It's a level of fear that is implicit in 1984. I think the Chinese state is, until you get to that level where people automatically follow instructions without being told, that they internalize the idea of following instructions, or they internalize the idea that a big brother is watching them, they will do it. And collection of DNA, this kind of, these CCTV cameras at every point. Look at little children today. Children are very aware. There's a CCTV camera there. In schools, especially now, for safety reasons, etc., there are CCTV cameras everywhere. So children have become used to. I once ran into a child that got into a lift in India. Now you see, and she looked around and said, "Oh, there is no camera in the lift." And I was astonished that a child should think that a camera in a lift is a normal thing, right? So that's how it's coming, and I think this is a form of control, and it's a form of perfecting control. And no authoritarian state will rest until it has absolute access to everything. I suppose eugenics is the next one, right? If you've seen the Netflix series called The Man in High Castle, yeah, so it's about, the Nazi thing was about perfect race. So you get rid of the lame, the ill, and you use DNA to basically figure out who's got a faulty gene, and that's it. He's out of the reproduction cycle. So it hasn't gotten to that extent yet. I think this is just, for now, it's a power play, but you never know where it's going, right? And I think human nature is one in which you have great, enlightened, compassionate souls like His Holiness, but you also have the reverse, the flip side of people who can go to any extent in terms of treating their fellow human beings like they aren't human. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Shiv. So I'm going to ask you to zoom out and then see what is happening in Beijing instead of what is happening in Lhasa. So the question that I wanted to raise particularly pertaining to your emphasis on new and the question of succession in Beijing. Yesterday we had a discussion about what he's trying to think about succession, whether he's planning in the mold of Deng Xiaoping, putting somebody who can perhaps basically following his path for his succession plan. So my question is, he is 69 and then he is in the third term, and I'm sure he's thinking about his succession plan, and then I'm sure he's thinking about cementing his legacy. So one of the places that I've been looking at and trying to see in what field that he's trying to cement his legacy, I've been trying to look with the emphasis of new, the new common prosperity program. And somebody like Wang Huning being the brain trust of what CPC's ideological trajectory will be. So my question would be, am I looking at the right places, or is he looking to cement his legacy, and in what ways would he be considering in trying to cement his legacy? Because he certainly believes that he is a man of historical significance.
Let me answer the first part of succession, Xi Jinping looking at a successor. So one of the theories I have for him removing the term limits, etc., is that Chinese politics had become predictable. So after the fall of Chao Tsiang as General Secretary, pretty much everybody knew once Jiang Zemin became, Hu Jintao was pretty much anointed successor. There was no change, right? Then after Hu Jintao, we knew Xi Jinping was, right? And now that's a level of predictability that is not even available in a democracy. I mean, who knew Trump would become president of the United States? So I think Xi Jinping must have looked across at China, across the United States and said, hey, look, nobody can tell what's going to happen in the United States. Why should anybody know what should happen in China, right? So I think, which I think is, if democracies, you can't tell who's going to win the next election. And if you can tell what's going to happen in China, it's because this had become a problem, because people were being cultivated on the assumption, sixth generation leaders were already being cultivated on the assumption that this guy is going to be the next party secretary, so I need to get on the right side of him. I mean, we see that to an extent in democratic politics also. Future leader, this is the guy we need to sort of focus on, etc. Xi Jinping decided that this was too much foreign influence, I think. And that is why he decided to do away with the succession system. Plus, he's got ideas. He's got a whole list of things he wants to do. So which brings me to the question of legacy. What do you think, what do I think is Xi Jinping focusing on as his legacy? I think he wants to leave the Communist Party stronger than ever. The idea that the party state can, for a time there was a challenge of the party faced of separating the party and the state, right? To ensure that China became a more normal country by, the state being separated more and more from the party. So, for example, the PLA is the party's army, not the national army, right? So, let's professionalize the PLA, let us make it less about the party, protecting the party, and more about protecting the country and so on. But I think under Xi Jinping, he realized, or people around him realized, that this is unacceptable, because the party needs to be the one in charge. And so one of his legacies, I think, will be the fact that this talk about separating party and state is done, finished. The other is he wants to leave China stronger than it has ever been. Clearly today China is seen as a potential future number one, right? And he wants to make sure that there are no missteps on that way, that the path is linear rather than likely to be blocked. He also wants to, I think, certainly in the way of Mao and Deng Xiaoping, leave an ideological system of thought behind. It's not very sharply ideological in the sense that Mao was. Mao was really creative in terms of new ideas and ways in which how he reformed the communists. Because if you adopted communism from the Soviet Union, the proletariat was supposed to be the vanguard of the revolution. But in China, the proletariat wouldn't succeed because there was hardly a proletariat. So the Chinese innovated. Mao innovated, saying the peasantry is going to be the vanguard of the revolution, right? So that's how the Communist Party won its victories in China. Xi Jinping, I think, is trying to do something else. He and Deng Xiaoping brought the idea of economic development. So you have a strong ideological state, you have a strong economic development. So all these things are already taken care of. So what is Xi going to bring? I think Xi is talking about what I talked about, this cultural element, the civilization of China. He keeps talking about a fine Chinese traditional culture. He has kept talking about this in his major policy speeches, the party congress documents and so on. So he is trying to create a form of legitimacy for the Communist Party that marries the Marxist-Leninist emphasis on economic development and material growth with what he thinks is the greatness of Chinese civilization, Chinese culture. And this is a potent mix, because even if economic development falls a bit, you can still have pride in your culture. What Mao did was out with the four olds, old habits, old superstitions, old customs. He practically, Confucius was anathema in Mao's era. So Mao wanted a clean break. Xi Jinping is not about clean breaks. He realizes, or he thinks, that you need to actually build on that foundation of Chinese legacy or Chinese culture or Chinese civilization, which is not going to go anywhere. So why not use it for the purposes of the Communist Party? And so we have today, I think, a very virulent form of nationalism, which makes it all the more difficult for ethnic minorities to express themselves. Which is why I think, approaches of the Tibetan exile movement to what's going on in China needs to change, perhaps, taking into account this reality that this is a party now, is a modern political entity, but is now sort of wedded to the idea of Chinese civilization as something great. And a lot of that, while yes, Chinese civilization is great, just like any other civilization is, but a lot of that is reconstruction, and a lot of it is also fake history. For example, the claims on Tibet. Who was Chinese 3,000 years ago? What was Chinese being something called Chinese 3,000 years ago? What was Indian 2,000 years ago? And as long as these sort of questions disappear, I think then we are looking at a world that is, or countries that are increasingly monochromatic, that do not respect diversity, that do not have space for plurality, and therefore are homogenizing. And I think and that's not a concern only for China, that's a concern also for other countries. When Trump talks about making America great again, he's essentially calling for whites, that's how the Republican Party right now is looking at it. Whites at the top of the hierarchy. So there are different ways in which countries are reacting to so-called perceived loss of status for hitherto traditionally dominant groups. In terms of legacy, I guess I would say that marrying of civilization and history with the political objectives of the Communist Party is going to be one of his big legacies.
So with this, we have to conclude over here. Though I really wish to have more time to have the more discussions and more questions regarding the topic, as many questions are coming from the audience, and I really would like to say thank you for that and your very active response from your side. But then due to time constraint that we have, so we have to conclude here. So before concluding today's sessions, I would like to request our director, Mr. Tenzin Topten, to say some few words on today's event.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Dr. Jabin, for humbly accepting our invitation and coming all the way from Delhi to here. We are hopeful and we are more, I should say, looking forward to collaborate with you, not only in Dharamsala but in Delhi as well, in more activities. And finally, I would like to thank all the visitors for coming here and making this program successful.
So on behalf of Tibet Museum of the Central Tibetan Administration, I would like to request our director Tenzin Topten to offer a small gift as a token of appreciation to our guest speaker, Dr. Jabin.
Please give a big round of applause to Dr. Jabin. Thank you, sir.